Welcome back. This is part 2 on our series about the history of communism. Today we are going to be covering the early Russian Revolution and the early days of the USSR. Before we get started though, I do want to remind you to like and subscribe because I know, looking at my analytics, that about 98% of you who are enjoying this wonderful video are not subscribed. Do it! Now, when we talk about communism, one of the things that we do have to talk about is the death toll. But I want to preface this because every time I talk about the death toll in communism, someone inevitably says something like this. Actually, there is no way communism has killed more than 100 million people because true communism has never been tried. Have you even read Marx? Wait, why are you walking away? And it's true. A lot of pro-communist people like to say that real communism or true communism has never been tried. And in a way, they're right. As we discussed in the last video, Karl Marx, the father of communism, described this system as no social classes, no need for money, no need for authority or government. And in that sense, yes, true communism has never been tried. But this pure communism can't happen because it depends on everybody being perfect and selfless, when in reality, humans are almost entirely selfish and imperfect. So yes, people are right when they say that true communism has never been tried, but this is flawed at the fundamental level because true communism is impossible. But the subjects of today's videos adjusted for this problem. We're going to talk about a lot of different people today, but I'd like to start out with two. Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky. These two guys were best friends, and they were painfully aware about this problem with the communist system. So instead of getting rid of all classes entirely, their solution was to create a single small class of superior, hyper-intelligent individuals who would make sure that nobody else ruined the system. And of course, they placed themselves at the top of this small, superior ruling class. Because who wouldn't? Now, this is also where I want to bring in George Orwell's masterpiece of a novella, Animal Farm. Animal Farm is an allegory for the Bolshevik Revolution, which is the series of events that allowed Trotsky and Lenin to come into power, changing Russia into the Soviet Union. At the beginning of this book, you have some pigs who become unhappy with their situation. They overthrow the farm, lead this revolution, and create this sort of communist utopia where all the farm animals are working together for the betterment of other animals. However, because they're leading the revolution, the pigs put themselves up at the top. And slowly from that point on, the pigs start becoming more and more corrupted, taking in the process more and more power for themselves and subjugating everybody around them. And this is exactly what happened in the Soviet Union. Now, the two major pigs in this story are Snowball, who represents both Lenin and Trotsky, and Napoleon, who mostly represents Stalin, but also represents a little bit of Lenin, the more violent side of Lenin, but mostly Stalin, like 90% Stalin. So let's focus first on that Snowball character, or Lenin and Trotsky. Prior to World War I and the Revolution, Lenin was thought to be too much of a troublemaker, and he was actually kicked out of Russia and not allowed to return. So when Germany wanted a quicker end to the war in the Eastern Front, they just took Lenin, sent him on a secret train back to Russia, and let him cause havoc, which he did. He immediately started sowing the seeds of insurrection among people who did not support Tsar Nicholas II. They start a new government, they create their own system, and there's a lot of details here that I could go into, but I find them a little bit boring and not super relevant to the topic of this. However, Oversimplified, which is probably my favorite history channel, has done a great job of explaining this, so you can go watch their video. I want to focus on Lenin and Trotsky's new system. Lenin and Trotsky had actually a pretty successful first few years. Many people who had not had access to a good education became literate under Lenin's reforms. Food was becoming much more plentiful and equally distributed, so just because you're living out in the middle of nowhere doesn't mean you were doomed to starve, and just because you were in Moscow didn't mean that you had to struggle or scrape by or were just extra well-fed. And to their credit, Orwell does talk about some of these initial successes in the book Animal Farm. Things are great after the revolution. It takes a while for the corruption and problems to set on. And I cannot stress this enough. Socially and economically speaking, Lenin and Trotsky made some major improvements. They were achieving what they promised, and that communist utopia seemed more reachable than ever. But this came at a cost. authoritarianism. You see, in reality, the Bolshevik Revolution had just replaced one ruling class under Tsar Nicholas with another ruling class under Trotsky and Lenin. And the only difference between the two was that the previous one was an inherited title, and there wasn't really a lineated version of who was going to become the successor of Lenin. In theory, under this new system, you could work for it and become the leader. But what work for it meant was largely vague. One man did just that. He worked really hard and rose to the ranks of the Communist Party in order to become the leader, and his name was Joseph Vissarionovich. But that wasn't a Russian-sounding name. That was a Georgian name. He didn't want to stick out for that reason. And on top of that, it's a hard name to say and pronounce. I probably didn't even get it correct. So he changed his last name to Stalin, which, unironically and roughly translated, means Iron Man. So when Lenin eventually died, Stalin pushed really hard to come into power and eventually banished Trotsky. Just like in Animal Farm, when Napoleon sees Snowball causing problems for him or getting in his way, or at least sees him as another competitor for power, he banishes Snowball. You see, Trotsky had been an idealist. He knew what that perfect system was, at least in theory, and he had some ideas of how to try and achieve that utopia. And whether or not his ideas would have worked are up for debate. But the chances certainly were higher of achieving utopia under Trotsky. Stalin, on the other hand, was not an idealist. Stalin wanted one thing: absolute, unquestionable power. And he got it. Now, Stalin was still a Marxist. He was still a communist. But he was more concerned with his own comforts and maintaining the image of power than he was with the utopia. In fact, he quickly did away with the concept of trying to achieve a utopia. He moved the goalposts to simply expanding the reach and authority of the Soviet Union. And to this end, he got rid of anybody who stood in his way, literally. Like, he invented a prototype of Photoshop so he could erase people from photos and make it look like they never existed. Under Stalin, about 9 million people died. More than 6 million of those deaths were a direct result of his policies. This means murders, assassinations, purges, worked to death in death camps, or any other way to die by Stalin's direct orders. Those remaining 3 million deaths were either due to starvation, deportation, or preventable disease. And that doesn't even include the deaths in World War II, because Stalin's strategy was essentially to throw more Russians at Germany than Germany had bullets, wait for the Germans to run out of bullets, and hoping that he hadn't yet run out of Russians, and then overpower them with sheer numbers. Which, to his credit, worked, but increased the death toll unnecessarily. So I cannot stress enough just how terrifying of a human being Stalin was. And it's crucial that you understand how terrifying it was to be around or work under or be ruled by this man in order for you to understand the irony and beauty of his ultimately humiliating death. Stalin's morning routine was pretty simple. He slept in until he felt like it, and nobody was allowed to enter his room until he called for them. In early March of 1953, Stalin was out with some of his political allies, way too late, partying way too hard and drinking way too much. The next morning, he slept in longer than usual, but nobody would go into his room to check on him because they didn't want to die in the frozen wasteland of Siberia. In fact, there's actually a Steve Buscemi movie about this, where they're arguing about who's going to go in and check on Stalin. Eventually, they decided it had been long enough, and someone needed to risk death to check on this dictator. So they come into his room, and they see Joseph Stalin lying face down on the floor in a puddle of his own urine. In fact, he had suffered a stroke and had been lying there, fully conscious, in said puddle of urine for hours. And he was still alive. He was still alive when they found him. They had to move him to the couch and spoon feed him for 3 days until he finally passed away. After his death, Soviet communism took a seriously much-needed chill pill. It was still pretty crazy there, and there's a lot of intense stories coming out of the Cold War, and some leaders were worse than others, but it definitely wasn't nearly as intense to live in the USSR as it was under Stalin. And this story isn't over because Soviet communism goes on for decades, but our next video we're actually going to pause and talk about Chinese communism. You can already read the article on my website, mrstockford.com. Once again, if you haven't already, like and subscribe. I'll see you in the future.